including 5 journalists. Cardinal Perry Lynn saying it makes no sense. There seems to be no openings for a solution. For more news with a Catholic perspective, visit EWTNnews.com. I'm Teresa Tomeo, and Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders starts now.
What's stopping you from becoming a Catholic?
Why can't women become priests?
1-833-288-EWTN.
I don't understand why I have to earn salvation.
1-833-288-3986.
What's stopping?
Why do I need to confess my sins to a priest?
What's stopping you? This is Called to Communion with Dr. David Anders on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
Hey everybody, welcome again to Call to Communion, the program for our non-Catholic brothers and sisters. If you've got a question about the Catholic faith, we would love to answer that question for you. Here's our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. If you're calling or listening from outside North America, please dial 1 and then 205-271-2985. You can also text the letters EWTN to 58177. Wait for our response. It'll be a real quick little robo response there. Once you get that, send us your first name and your brief question, message, and data rates may apply. You can also send us an email if you would rather do that, ctc@ewtn.com, ctc@ewtn.com. We have the best team in radio handling things today. Pedro Quiles, our producer. Matt Kabinski, our phone screener. Rich Jesse is on social media. If you'd like to ask a question via YouTube or Facebook, we're streaming on both those platforms right now. Just put your question in the comments box, if you would, please. Rich will see that. He'll shoot it to us here in the studio, and we are off to the races. Coming to you from the 2025 EWTN Radio Conference in Tysons Corner, Virginia. I'm Tom Price, along with Dr. David Anders.
Tom, how are you today?
I'm very well. How are you, my friend?
We're doing okay down here. The weather has turned in Alabama, at least for the moment. It's in the 70s after, having been trucking up along the upper 90s, 3 weeks ago. So we're
fantastic.
We're pleased with that.
Yeah, it was 70 degrees here in the D.C. area when I woke up this morning, and it's about the same here, so it is absolutely fantastic. We're going to go to the phones in just a couple of moments here. Calls already coming in, but there is room for your call at 833-288-EWTN. David, we're going to lead off here with a YouTube question that came in yesterday, correct?
Yeah, that's right. So Scott was on YouTube. We didn't get a chance to answer his question, so here it is held over from yesterday. Scott says, why does the church only require confession once a year if we can't receive communion with a mortal sin? Plus, we could die at any moment within that year. Okay, thanks. So the requirement of annual confession was put into church law in 1215 at the Fourth Lateran Council. At the same time, the church mandated annual communion, and in the Middle Ages, it was not common for the laity to go to communion every week. That was very, very, very rare. And in fact, many people didn't go to communion at all, which is why the church said, hey, you got to go to communion some. You should go at least once a year. That was the way they were framing it.
Yeah.
And so annual communion, annual confession. And as late as the 18th century, this was still the pattern. If you've ever bothered to read the sermons of St. John Vianney, for example, he made a big deal out of preparing for your Easter communion by preparing for your annual confession. And in his instance, he got in a lot of trouble with the yokels because the young men, they wouldn't want to go to St. John Vianney because they'd go to him for confession, and he would inquire about their lives, and he'd say, well, I'm not going to absolve you and let you go to communion unless you would agree to give up the following things. They were like, but I don't want to give up the following things. The priest down the road, he doesn't make me give up the following things. And John Vianney would say, yeah, but you're not sitting in his confessional, are you? I won't absolve you, and I won't admit you to communion unless you give up the following things. And so, if you were looking for holiness of life, he was your man. If you were looking for laxity, you went down the street. But that you have to kind of understand the annual confession thing in terms of the annual communion thing. Now, if you are a frequent communicant and you have no consciousness of mortal sin, well, you're good to go to communion, right? The church only
Yeah,
tells you
yeah.
to refrain from communion if you're conscious of mortal sin. The presumption is Catholics live free of mortal sin. That's the presumption. I mean, when you become Catholic, you agree to give up certain behaviors that would qualify as mortal sins. And the church teaches that with God's grace, it is possible to do so. So if you live free of mortal sin, there's no necessity to go to confession very frequently. And in fact, what the church mandates about annual confession is an annual confession of all known mortal sins. So I'm not recommending this, but theoretically, if you passed a year with no mortal sins, you would not have a canonical obligation to go to confession. Now, in practice, the saints of great holiness, who you know live their lives without mortal sin, made frequent use of the confessional because it has other benefits beyond the mere absolution of mortal sins. I mean, it's a spiritual practice that inculcates humility and gives grace, and so Catholics make it a regular part of their lives above and beyond that annual confession.
Well, yeah, I mean, look at St. Pope John Paul the Great, who went every week.
I thought he went every day.
Well, I guess that's a possibility.
I think he went every
Did you have
day.
another question there?
Yeah, let's see.
Was there another question
we
we
got
received?
another one. This one is from Tony. Dr. Anders, could you
Okay.
please address the Lutheran claim that Nicaea II invented the practice of the veneration of images, and that it wasn't actually a practice of the early church? Well, I was not aware that the Lutherans made that claim because it's so clearly historically false. I mean, what precipitated the Second Council of Nicaea was the ideological movement known as iconoclasm, which was the destruction of religious images. So why would you have a council to address the destruction of images if there weren't any images?
Well, yeah.
Like the claim, it makes no sense historically.
No.
Yeah.
Okay, well, there you go. And thanks for your questions via YouTube. If you would like to send us an email for a future show, here's the address, ctc@ewtn.com, ctc@ewtn.com. On each of our programs, we try to answer a couple of YouTube questions, a couple of emails, and then once a month or so, we'll do a special mailbag show where we'll answer as many as we can that have come in over the past couple of weeks. Again, that address, ctc@ewtn.com. All right, just a couple of minutes here. We're going to go to the phones. We'll be talking with Trent. He is a first-time caller from Athens, Georgia. We also have Daniel standing by, another first-time caller from North Dakota. Lines available for you as well, 833-288-EWTN. If you have a question for Dr. David Anders, 833-288-3986. Call to communion on this beautiful Tuesday afternoon here on EWTN. Do stay with us.
On the next Catholic Connection with Teresa Tomeo.
As we say in Radioland, don't touch that dial. Hi, it's Teresa Tomeo, and what a blessing it is for me to speak to you every morning on EWTN Global Catholic Radio, bringing you the latest news, important interviews on all that's happening in the church and the world, and all of this from a truly Catholic perspective. See you on Catholic Radio.
Catholic Connection with Teresa Tomeo, weekday mornings 9 Eastern on EWTN Radio.
This is a digital moment with Sandra McDevitt. Did you know the Union Jack flag has 3 patron saints and a link to the Crusades? The red cross is for St. George, patron of England. The cross was brought back by the Crusaders and displayed on their chests. The cross is superimposed over the white cross with the blue background. It is in the shape of an X for St. Andrew, patron of Scotland, who was crucified on an X-shaped cross. The thin red cross is for St. Patrick, patron of Ireland. It is positioned not to obscure the cross of St. Andrew. The term Union is for England, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. Jack is what the flag was called flying from the bow of naval vessels. A flag with 3 saints and a link to the Crusades. Pretty cool. I'm Sandra McDevitt for EWTN Radio.
It's It's called a Communion with Dr. David Anders here on EWTN. Our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. If you would like to call us from outside of North America, that number for you, 1-205-271-2985. And if you're looking for the real deal, all about the Catholic faith, you can trust Catholic News Agency. Reply on CNA to cover the mission and activities of the Catholic Church, including social, political, moral, and cultural issues, always from a perspective of faith. You can rely on Catholic News Agency. For all the latest Catholic news, visit CatholicNewsAgency.com, an online service from EWTN. You can also get timely news updates from CNA right there in your inbox. Visit EWTN.com and click subscribe. If you're ready now, let's go to the phones at 833-288-EWTN. We're going to begin with Daniel, a first-time caller from North Dakota, listening on the great Real Presence Radio. Hey, Daniel, what's on your mind today, sir?
Hi. I have a pretty complicated question, and so I'll try to make it quick.
I love complicated questions.
My wife is teaching a course on beauty, and from a Catholic perspective, and I've been talking to her about it a lot and trying to help come up with examples that are tangible for her students. And two of the things that you've talked about in the last week have really been bouncing around in my head, and so I kind of want to tie this back to like beauty and the expression of beauty as a pathway to God and to understanding God. So here are the 2 points, and then I have my question after that. So you mentioned the idea of an image of Cicero. As you say, yes, that's Cicero, but it doesn't truly have. It isn't Cicero himself. It points to Cicero, that it contains some of his characteristics, and that one of the special things about the sacraments, and especially the Mass, is that yes, it points to, and yes, it's an image of this, but also it does make that truly present. It makes Jesus' death and like resurrection present, physically, tangibly, truly. Maybe tangibly is a strong word there. So there's that, and then there's also the justification for the Catholics. We believe that it comes through our reception of Jesus, and that as we conform ourselves to Jesus and we receive his divine life and his grace, that it transforms the spiritual character of our soul. But that way, when we die, we already are in a state of conformity to God and a closeness to God that enables us to receive the grace of being able to go to heaven. Is at least close to the right idea. And so kind of what I'm wondering is, I have this image of like the Cicero painting, and that we are made in image and likeness of God, and that there's a sacramental worldview that our actions and the physical world make visible invisible truths and realities, and God being the supreme invisible reality. And I'm just trying to understand, like, how would we describe that? I'm picturing creation from an image and likeness of God. So we kind of have the substance of God, that we have some of his characteristics, but not his true full substance. And then the other part of it is there's that question about how do we understand the substance? And then when we sin or when we do evil, is that making tangible of the substance of evil? Or how could we categorize and describe that without teaching heresy?
I'm with you. I'm totally with you. Thank you so much. So first of all, let me just tell you, go read Augustine. Just read Augustine. I mean, you just need to read Augustine, particularly the Confessions, because he's all about these themes, and I will address them. I'll talk about them in the air, but you will get such a more erudite, beautiful, authoritative account when you read the works of Augustine and other Catholic doctors as well. Augustine says in the Confessions that, and this is a paraphrase, that when he looks at beautiful objects, he is keenly aware that they're not God, and yet they evoke God. And so, when he sees, he knows that God is not a beautiful sunset, but he knows that God is something beautiful. right? That there's a kind of resonance, there's a kind of analogy there, and he lays as much stress on the distance and the dissimilarity as the similarity, right? It's as compelling to him that God's beauty, whatever that means, is infinitely remote from the beauty of the sunset. That's just as interesting a fact as that it's evoked by the sunset, but God is not a sunset. And when you get to the question, okay, yeah, but what is God? Well, then we lapse into silence, right? But if the Catholic definition of God is essentially where the buck stops, where the explanatory or metaphysical buck stops, that's what we mean by God. Now, nobody knows where the buck stops. I mean, the best physicists in the world just keep drilling down to greater and greater levels of analysis and making finer and finer distinctions, but we never arrive at the very bottom of the explanatory, well, or the top of the explanatory hierarchy, if you will. We just keep further refining it, but without ever knowing fundamentally, like, what is it? We don't know. We just don't know. It vanishes into mystery, and that Catholics understand God that way, that however high you go in the explanatory hierarchy, that we don't know what's at the top, and whatever that is, that's just what we mean by God. But everything that exists, including its quality of goodness, beauty, and being, and truth, derives ultimately from that first cause. So in God is the source of all these things, even though God is not, a rabbit or a mouse or a tree or a sunset or any of these kinds of things. So there's a connection. The one evokes the other, but the highest explanatory item essentially escapes our understanding. Now, your discussion of the moral character, the moral beauty that is reflected in us as we reflect the character of Christ, I think is quite apt. And I think Augustine would completely agree with that. I do want to make one kind of qualification to something you said at the outset when you were talking about the relationship of the Mass to Calvary. And you got that pretty much right. I mean, you invoked St. Thomas's discussion of the way in which the Mass is a sacrifice, and he says it's a sacrifice. We call it a sacrifice in the same way we call a picture of Cicero, because it points to the archetype, and the Mass is a picture, a representation of Christ's death at Calvary, and in that way we say it's a sacrifice. But the language about the Mass somehow making his death actually present is going beyond the language of the Church. What the Church says is that the virtue, the power, the grace of Christ's death is made present in the Mass. It doesn't say that his actual death is made present. In fact, the Church is emphatic that the Eucharist is an unbloody offering, right? So the death happened in the historical past, but the fruits, the benefits of the death are made present to us, not the death itself. I just want to add that qualification.
Okay. Daniel, thanks so much for your call, and don't be a stranger. Hope to hear from you again. Love everybody listening to us on the great Real Presence Radio. And that opens up a line for you right now at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Call to communion on this Tuesday afternoon here on EWTN. Let's go to Colleen now, calling from New York, listening on the great Station of the Cross. Hey, Colleen, what's on your mind today? Colleen in New York, are you there? Colleen is not quite with us. David, why don't we go to an email question while we're waiting for Colleen?
Okay, great. Yeah, fantastic. Okay, so we have an email here from, hang on one second. All right. How could Joseph, this is from Maria, how could Joseph have divorced Mary quietly? Wouldn't the entire town have known what happened? Okay, that's a great question. And in fact, I know very little about the customs surrounding divorce in first century Judea. But presumably, I mean, even something that has a recognized legal procedure can be done with more or less fanfare. And so however it is that St. Joseph behaved, he had determined to behave as discreetly as possible given the confines of the cultural tradition.
Okay, very good. Thanks for that. Here's a question from Kevin watching us on YouTube this afternoon. Can Dr. Anders please explain the purpose of Christ's death? Is it just so that we can be forgiven of our sins? Couldn't God have forgiven us without having Christ die?
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate the question. So first of all, there's absolutely no metaphysical necessity in Christ's death, meaning God was not compelled by something outside of himself for Christ to die, nor is he compelled by some exigency of his own nature, right? The plan of salvation is very much the free-willed decision of God. He could have done it differently, or he could have omitted it altogether. And the Catholic Church is emphatic about that. God was under no necessity to save us, and he was under no necessity to save us in this manner. And when St. Thomas Aquinas poses this question, he asks, could God have saved us in some way other than the death of Christ? And Thomas says, yes, he could have. And so in fact, St. Athanasius raises the same question in his I think it's his 2 epistles against the Arians. I think that's where he addresses it when he asks the question, couldn't God just have forgiven us by fiat? Just said, okay, I forgive you. And Athanasius answers, yeah, he could have. But here's the fascinating thing, and even though Athanasius did not anticipate Luther, no one anticipated Luther. Luther's doctrine was another novelty and a surprise to people because nobody had said anything like that for 1,500 years. But Athanasius's approach to the question, is kind of an answer to what would ultimately be the Lutheran proposition, could God just forgive us by fiat? And that's sort of, the justification by faith alone idea. And Athanasius says, well, he could have, but if he did that, all other things being equal, we would just have kept on sinning. Right? So, you sin a bunch, God says, you're forgiven, and then you sin again, right? And so he appointed a means of salvation that was designed not only for the remission of our sins, but for the transformation of our character, for the renewing of our minds. And so we look at the way the death of Christ changes our character. And there's so many that we could talk about, but, St. Peter says in his epistle that one of the things that Christ's death does is give us an example of charity that we are to follow. And then another thing that Christ's death does is the power of Christ's death and resurrection is imprinted into our character supernaturally by the Holy Spirit, so that our lives themselves become cruciform, if you will.
Okay. Appreciate that. Thanks so much for your question. Let's go now to Colleen in New York, listening on the great station of the Cross. Hey, Colleen, what's on your mind today?
Hi. I had a question. So my question is, I go to Mass frequently, and I just moved to this new area, and on Sunday Mass, I feel that the priest could possibly be irreverent and heterodox. And what I mean by that, the few things I've noticed is when he gives his homily, it doesn't pertain to the gospel. He talks about himself a lot. The second thing that bothers me the most is when he's consecrating the Eucharist, he has one hand. And I've never really seen that. And then the last thing is at the end of the Mass, before everybody leaves, it's like a joke session. And he'll say, who has an anniversary, who has a birthday, and then he'll make jokes and just kind of goof around. So if I go to confession with him, am I seeing that he's not Orthodox?
Okay, thanks.
No?
I really appreciate the question. Thank you so much. So first of all, everything you have said, nothing you have said, rather, gives me evidence to impugn the priest's orthodoxy. Right? Orthodoxy means that he affirms the dogmatic teaching of the Church. Nothing that you've said tells me one way or another whether he affirms or denies the dogmatic teaching. So I'm going to charitably presume that he's Orthodox because he has his bishop's approbation, and you haven't brought a charge of you haven't brought a concrete charge of heresy against him, which would mean that he obstinately denied a dogma of the faith, and you haven't suggested that he has. Okay. So you've said that his homilies don't pertain to the gospel, that he has a kind of jocular demeanor, that in your perception maybe he lacks reverence towards the Mass. Are those things problematic? Okay, well, they're all problematic in that. So first of all, the instructions of the Church regarding homiletics are pretty clear, that the priest is supposed to discuss the text of the Mass in his homily. He's supposed to reference the reading of the Gospel or the Epistle or the Old Testament or the Psalm or even the propers of the Mass. He's supposed to address the variable readings or whatever. I mean, he should reference the text of the Mass. And if it's just a kind of ad lib, off the cuff thing where he talks about his own life, then it suggests maybe he's not taking his task of homiletics all that seriously. In terms of the jocularity of the thing, again, so what could be going on here? I have known priests that who I like. I mean, I would count them among my friends, who I think have a false notion that if they come across super casual, that they'll put people at ease. And I think that's a naive judgment on the part of the priest, and your call is proof that it's naive, because for many people that jocularity, far from putting them at ease, puts them on edge. And I'm thinking about one priest in particular who would mess around with the words of the Mass. He never messed around with the words of consecration, right? He never invalidated the Mass, but he just couldn't seem to stick to a rubric. And I think he thought he was being cute, but the consequence was that everybody in the church sat around waiting for the other shoe to drop, terrified that he was going to say something out of line. Now, hold that thought. I want to come back to it after the break.
Sit tight, Colleen. We'll continue with that thought in just a moment. We'll also talk with Trent from Athens, Georgia. Lines available for you as well, 833-288-EWTN for Call to Communion. Do stay with us.
Have you ever noticed that the world associates fanaticism with religion? But G.K. Chesterton says the strangest fanaticism that fills our time is the fanatical hatred of morality, especially Christian morality. It's the irreligious who are fanatical in their hatred of religion. They hate religion because religion is the only basis for morality. They hate morality because it's clear that they prefer things to be vague to the point where they can call wrongs rights. You cannot call something a right when it defies God's laws. We can only call it a sin. If we really care about respecting human rights, Chesterton says, we need to treat them as divine rights. All rights come from God, and God is not going to break his own laws. Neither should we.
Spend more time with the Apostle of Common Sense. Visit chesterton.org for more information.
Why do we need to pray? We don't pray because God needs our prayers. We pray because we need God's grace. And every day, when I face the day, I realize I have no idea what I'm doing. And I need God to walk me through my day, step by step, giving me the grace, the counsel, the love, the encouragement that enables me to glorify him in everything that I do and become the person he wants me to be. Prayer is my lifeline.
Hi, this is Cy Kellett from Catholic Answers Live.
This is Jerry Usher from Take Two with Jerry and Debbie.
This is Colleen Kelly-Mast.
This is Dr. David Anders.
The most trusted Catholic voices are on EWTN Radio.
Tomorrow on More to Life, the life you were meant to live.
We'll look at how the theology of the body can help you live a more abundant life.
That's tomorrow on More to Life, 10 a.m. Eastern, 9 Central on EWTN Radio.
Now back to Called to Communion with Dr. David Anders.
It's Called to Communion with Dr. David Anders here on EWTN. Our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Before the break, we were talking with Colleen in New York. She has some concerns about her priest who's elevating the host with one hand, making some jokes and things like that. Right, David?
Yep, exactly. Her perception is kind of a lack of reverence for the Mass, maybe not taking the thing seriously, overly jocular. And I was telling a story about a priest that I know who I had sort of an analogous problem in that he would mess around with the language of the liturgy. And I think he thinks he's being cute, but it really creates a lot of anxiety in the part of the faithful. And I think it's a bad pastoral strategy. You ought to do what the church says. You ought to pay attention to your homilies. You ought to be reverent and so forth. But the concern she had, does this mean he's not Orthodox? Well, first of all, no, right? It doesn't. It doesn't mean he's not Orthodox. And secondly, she had specific concerns about the confessional. And, this one priest I have in mind who has this kind of, bad habit of sort of messing around with the language of the liturgy, happens to be an immensely charitable person with a deeply pastoral heart. And so even though I think the strategy is misinformed, I think that his motive is he wants to help the people of God, and he maybe doesn't have the best sense of how to do that, but I'm perfectly persuaded that his motive is a benevolent one. I think it's misinformed, ignorant, but nevertheless benevolent. Yeah. And I would have no objection to going to confession to him because I would expect a deeply compassionate and pastoral approach, right? And even if you don't, right, I mean, even if you go to a priest who is maybe not a skillful confessor or gives cavalier advice or even bad advice, it doesn't invalidate the confession, right? I mean, provided the priest intends to do what the church means by confession and you bring your genuine contrition and purpose of amendment, you will be absolved. You will be absolved. Now, that being said, there's no objection to seeking out confessors that you think are more helpful to you. And to be sure, if there is a confessor that creates a great deal of anxiety in your soul for whatever reason, then better not to go to that guy. You know, I mean, just completely very analogous situation, a different situation, but same concern. In religious orders that are made up of priests and lay brothers, the lay brothers don't go to confession to the priests in their own religious order, in their priory or their friary or their congregation. They bring somebody in from the outside. So, like when the friars at EWTN, when they go to confession, they don't go to confession to each other. Right, they bring one of the diocesan guys in, or maybe a religious from another congregation hears their confessions. Well, why? Why would they do that? Well, they're probably confessing that they're mad at the guy next to them at the dinner table, right? You know, and so like it's okay to be selective in who you go to confession to if you have some prudent reason to do so. And a prudent reason would be this priest gives me the willies. Okay, well, don't go to the guy that gives you the willies. Go to the guy that is going to encourage you in your relationship with God.
Colleen, is that helpful for you?
That's very helpful, and I really appreciate the answer. My problem is I live in the middle of nowhere.
Well, then you go to confession to the priest who gives you the willies. You know, I mean, I've done that plenty of times.
Yeah, I hear you.
You know, I confession shop. I admit to it. Like when I'm kicking around my own diocese to go to confession, I go, well, who's hearing confessions today? And I kind of have my favorites. And I'll call up and go, you know, who's on the schedule? And, oh, it's Father so-and-so. I'm first in line. And every once in a while, I just really want to go to confession, and Father so-and-so's not there. And I'm like, oh, shucks, I guess I'll go to Father other guy, you know, and so I go.
Yeah. Colleen, thanks so much for your call. It is Call to Communion here on EWTN. Our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. Still time for your phone call, 833-288-3986. Got a call from Trent in Athens, Georgia, listening on Athens Catholic Radio. Hey, Trent, what's on your mind today, sir?
Yeah, the other day I was reading the prophet Jeremiah, and I mean, this passage is just one example that kind of the type of passage that comes up a lot when you're reading, especially Old Testament. But the context is, you know, Jerusalem's about to be besieged and conquered. And of course, during the siege, you know, the people are starving and they end up eating each other. But before that happens, Jeremiah prophesies, and he says, you know, thus, you know, saith the Lord, and God says that I will feed you the flesh of your children. And, you know, this just seems very harsh to me. And now he says the reason, because like they were sacrificing their children to Baal, so I guess it kind of makes sense, but at the same, or Moloch, one of them, but like, you know, it just, how do you reconcile that with like Jesus Christ, who said, forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do?
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate the question. So there's a really interesting book by a Jewish biblical scholar named Jacob Wright. The title of the book is Why the Bible Began. And it's an attempt to tell the story of the anonymous scribes that compiled, they didn't necessarily compose, but compiled and edited the text of scriptures that would ultimately come to be known to us as the Old Testament. And of course, they did so basically after the exile. And Wright's thesis, which I am persuaded of, is that one of the dominant concerns of the royal scribes that put these texts together was to do so to create a collection that would help the people process the trauma of the conquest and the exile. So, hands down, the most formative event for the development of what would ultimately become Judaism was this trauma of having the identity of being God's chosen people, and then having that identity utterly, utterly demolished. The end of the Davidic dynasty, seemingly, the exile from the Promised Land, the complete loss of the northern tribes, and it looked like the gig was up. And how do you make sense of that? And the truth of the matter is the Old Testament gives multiple different perspectives on answering that question. So characteristic of one strand of Old Testament writing, the Deuteronomic history, right, and the book of Deuteronomy, is a sort of straightforward, do good and you'll be blessed, do evil and you will be cursed kind of narrative. All right, and that seems fairly straightforward and easy to understand. And so from that point of view, when bad stuff happens to Israel, well, it must be because of our sins, right? That everything is within the providence and control of God. And so, if this bad thing happen to us, we must somehow deserve it. Now, alongside that narrative, there's another narrative, I think best exemplified by the book of Job. Job tells us explicitly, Job did nothing wrong. He was a righteous man, righteous in all his generations, someone in whom God could find no fault. And in fact, it is precisely Job's righteousness rather than his wickedness that prompts the conversation between Satan and God that leads to Job's suffering. And all of Job's companions are trying to find the intelligibility, the explanation. What is it about Job's behavior that has prompted God to allow this suffering? And of course, the answer is they're all wrong. None of them can put their finger on the problem, and none of them understands. And when God finally shows up and gives an account of himself to Job, he never gives Job an answer. He doesn't. Go read it. He does not justify his behavior. He says, I'm God, I do what I want, but he doesn't ever really explain himself to God. And so one way of reading the book of Job is that from our point of view, evil is ultimately unintelligible. In other words, the narrative of Deuteronomy is not the case, right? That it falls short, right? There is yet another account of evil that you find in the Old Testament. The author of Ecclesiastes says, hey, life is really hard. It's difficult. It doesn't make a lot of sense. Maybe there's no God. Maybe there's no God. That's Ecclesiastes. That's also in the Bible. And the psalmist in Psalm 88, and other similar psalms of lament, seems to sort of split the difference. And he says, you know what? It really feels like there's no God because I'm suffering a lot and God's not here. And we heard about these great promises. Hey, where are you, God? Why don't you show up? Please do something. Can you make it right? That's yet another perspective. And then finally, when you move into some of the later prophets, the post-exilic prophets like Ezekiel and then especially the book of Daniel, you get another take. And that is, okay, maybe there's another agent involved, right? Maybe there are evil forces at work in the world, even in the cosmic realm, that are the proximate cause of evil, and that for some reason God has allowed free rein to these characters. But his promises to Israel are going to be fulfilled in a kind of cosmic note at the end of time and the resurrection of the dead. And that's clearly Daniel's perspective. That's the one that seems to take hold in the New Testament. And so the apostles asked Jesus concerning the blind man, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Jesus says, neither this man nor his parents sinned, but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. Right? So yet another account of why there's evil. And then ultimately, the whole, the sort of conquestorial battle military motif of the Old Testament gets translated into a higher key, and it becomes our battle is not against flesh and blood, but powers and principalities in the heavenly realms. That's that Daniel motif again, wherein Christ is clearly the victor, but in a very paradoxical way. He defeats evil by submitting to it. And what comes out of the trauma of Christ's resurrection is new birth and life to the world. And so what Jesus does in effect is recapitulate in his own person the destiny of Israel that the prophets had prophesied, that ruin and destruction is going to come on Israel, and Jeremiah clearly tells us this. But you start looking into the post-exilic prophets, and they're like, yeah, but you know what? Something's going to come out of that. And Isaiah's servant songs are the perfect illustration, right? That the suffering of the servant is going to bring new life and justification to the many. And what Isaiah did not know was how that would be fulfilled not only in the nation of Israel, but in the singular individual of Jesus, who will ultimately conquer all that evil by taking it on himself.
Trent, thanks so much for your call. Glad that you checked in from Athens, Georgia. It is Called to Communion here on EWTN. If you're familiar with Podcast Central, our fantastic platform of over 100 great podcasts from literally all over the world, and one of them is called Just a Guy in the Pew. We're talking Catholic man to Catholic man. No fancy jargon, just real honest conversations from the heart as John and Victor discuss the struggles, challenges, and unimaginable joy of following Christ. You can hear Just Another Guy in the Pew and other faith-filled podcasts at EWTN's Podcast Central. Visit EWTN.com/podcasts today. Do check it out. It is a wonderful, wonderful platform. Back to the phones now. Let's talk with Tom in the beautiful city of McKinney, Texas, listening on Sirius XM, Channel 130. Hey, Tom, what's on your mind today, sir?
Yes, Dr. Anders, I know you were a convert. We start our OCIA program next week, and I just thought you could give me some pointers that would maybe help us to be able to connect with the people. It seems like to me, we've got almost 2,000 years of church history, and we're trying to cram it in within an 8-month period. And, we start out nice, I think, and then it goes from general math to calculus 2, and there's so much there. And our Lord will meet us wherever we're at. I've encouraged some of the leaders that if someone is coming from a sola scriptura church, let's show them the Catholic Church in the Bible, and they can relate to that. Others maybe are unchurched, and we need to take a different approach. Any recommendations?
Yeah, certainly. So, Tom, let me ask you a couple of questions. Just to be clear,
yes.
Are you enrolling as a candidate in RCIA, or are you teaching RCIA?
I'm one of the teachers.
You're one of the teachers. Okay, all right, fantastic.
Facilitators.
Yeah, okay, I got you. I want to be clear. I knew what perspective you were taking. Okay, so the change from rite of Christian initiation to order of Christian initiation is significant. And it goes deeper, I think, into the mind of the church about what's going on here. That to enter into this is to enter an order in the church. And as you know from the structure of the thing, it's not just about dogmatic teaching, right? It's about entering into an order of Christian life and being initiated into practices. So the rite of election, the illuminations, the scrutinies, all of these are intrinsic to the ultimate goal of RCIA, which is again not just head knowledge, but transformation of personality, of consciousness, of moral life. And in antiquity, they actually reserved the dogmatic and sacramental teachings to the very end, and they began with the moral teachings. And so the presumption was you have to get people's lives in order before you can give them the mysteries. Now today, sometimes we turn that on its head. We take the most abstruse, hard to understand abstract doctrines, put them at the very beginning, and then leave the moral stuff to the very end. That's the exact opposite of what the ancients did. And so I think keeping that in mind, like the objective here is not just to inform them of Catholic dogmatics. It is to initiate them into a way of life. Because look, becoming a Catholic is to adopt a way of life. It's to join a community, to take on certain practices that the church believes are intrinsically transformative if they are approached with the proper disposition. And so that, I think, is your goal. It's not, can I make sure they can define the Trinity? No. It's, can I help them to appropriate the sacraments in a life-giving way? Now, how do you do that? What is the most important approach to take if your objective is to help them appropriate the sacraments in a life-giving way? Hands down, Pope Francis taught this, but all the great doctors of the church teach this. You must zero in on the kerygma, the proclamation of Christ's life, death, resurrection, and ascension into heaven. And you connect the lived experience of the Christian life and the lived experience of the sacramental mysteries to the cruciform, resurrected nature of Christ's person, right? So to take an example, baptism is not just the rite of entrance into the church. It is identifying with Christ in his death and resurrection, that becomes the pattern of your own life. The most misunderstood doctrine in Catholic catechetics is the manner in which the Eucharist is source and summit, right? We know the Eucharist is source and summit. Very few people know how it's the source and summit. What the documents of the Second Vatican Council teach us is that it is the source and summit insofar as it is the sacrifice of the Mass. It's not just the doctrine of the real presence. It's the dynamic of Christ's death and resurrection that is presented to us in the Mass, to which we are to conform our lives. And so the proper disposition for receiving Holy Communion, for going to Mass, is what St. Augustine told his catechumens was, become what you see. When you see the drama of Christ's death and resurrection represented in the Mass, be determined to live that out in your own lives, the death and resurrection. Now, if you're a married person, right, your vocation is to live that out specifically in the context of your marriage. Again, one of the sort of alterations in the way we present the sacrament of matrimony is a lot of times you'll hear the theme repeated that the Trinity is the image of Christian marriage. Except that's true, but that's not the biblical image. The biblical image is the cross is the image of Christian marriage, right? The giving up of oneself, the dying to oneself so that one can bring one's spouse to holiness and to God. At the end of which, yes, we're aiming for Trinitarian communion. But you can't start there. You don't get to Trinitarian communion except by way of the cross. And so the inescapably ethical and transformative aspect of Christian experience and the whole logic of Catholic faith, which is to be renewed after the likeness and image of Jesus, so we become fundamentally new men and women in him, I think that's got to constantly be put in the forefront, not only in our dogmatic teaching, but in our prayers, in our behavior and our activity, and in all of the ritual that go into RCA. Does that make sense to you?
Yes.
Fantastic.
Yes.
Tom, thanks so much for your call from McKinney. Let's go to Suzanne now in Gibson, British Columbia, listening online, EWTN.com. Hey there, Suzanne. What's on your mind today?
Hello. I'm phoning because I've experienced in parishes like where you can belong for a long time and then not really feel like you belong, like we are loved by Jesus. So I go, for Jesus in the Blessed Sacrament, but it can sometimes feel like you're just tolerated by like the community and like, it's pretty wonderful, but it's still like it's not the way it's supposed to be. Like the early church, they were all one, like Jesus wants us all to be one. Uh-huh. So I've been thinking about it and just trying to figure out like how we could reach people. So I'm wanting to know if you have any ideas, Dr. Anders, like how we could break through these divisions that happen within parishes, because like the Bible, like Jesus is the Alpha, like he is the King of Kings, and the Alpha is like the leader, and he says to love everyone. He doesn't say love everyone except for Suzanne and her kids, or except for whoever is being shunned by like parishes or the church. So it's kind of like we're supposed to be loving children, like we're supposed to have the attitude of children, just like love, that grace that children have where they're just like loving, because if we're not loving, then we can't go into heaven if we're not loving. So we're supposed to love one another. And so when people are being shunned, presumably it's because they are afraid, so Jean Vianney says, like, if people are not accepted, it's because they are not forgiven. And his advice on that was like, well, none of us deserve to be forgiven.
So Suzanne, I love your question. I got all kinds of thoughts about it, and I totally understand what you're saying. I agree with your admonitions. I kind of feel like we need to give Suzanne your own show. Like you're preaching to the choir here, lady. Yeah. I mean, like I like what you're saying. Your analysis is correct, right? So there are a lot of dynamics that flow into this, and I can name a few, and then we can talk about some solutions. So one of like the perennial wound in the heart of Catholic ecclesiology and pastoral ministry is the sin of clericalism, which is the idea that the priest, in virtue of his ordination, is a higher caste of human being, and it's all about the priest. And priests who partake of this live it out in a variety of ways. They can become jealous of their authority and their power. They can be like the person that Christ condemns, who says, if you say your prayers to be seen by men, if you enjoy being called father or rabbi in the marketplace, you've got your reward in full. The way power and privilege can be held, guarded jealousy and criticism turned aside, and constructive criticism in particular. All those things can pervade the life of a parish, and then it filters down to the laity insofar as when you have a kind of clericalism that pervades the presbyterate, then the priest ends up, delegating cronies to positions of authority within the parish, either in a de jure or a de facto way. And then they sort of take on a little bit of the mantle of that, like I'm father's, appointed representative for this thing, and then they become a kind of bottleneck, or the moat dragon that you have to get around to get anything done. And even if the person involved is not himself a cleric, they sort of bask in the clerical glow and take on an element of that. I mean, when I used to work in diocesan ministry, we would talk about institutions where if you wanted to get anything done, you had to figure out who the moat dragon was and how to get around that individual. And I mean, I've seen situations where people were positively chased out of Catholic ministry by a lay person, not by a priest, but because that layperson thought that, you were muscling in on their territory. I mean, this has happened to me. Like, actually, I was involved in a parish one time where I got kicked off the rolls of home Bible studies because I didn't use the NCLIC's curriculum, and instead I used John Bergsma's Bible Study Basics for Catholics, which, by the way, is a great book, and I recommend you use in your Bible study, right? But they literally took me off the rolls because I wouldn't toe in the party line, So, I mean, that happens, right? And I think that clericalism is one of the roots of that, and the solution, unfortunately, for that at a deep level is a change of clerical culture, and that's nothing that you and I can directly affect. Although we can point it out and speak about it a lot, and hopefully make noise about it and draw attention to it. But there's got to be some action from the clerical caste to make that happen. So that's one issue. I mean, there are kinds of false piety that can pervade the life of the Christian faithful that work at cross purposes to charity. St. Paul talks about them in the book of 1 Corinthians. He criticizes, say, for example, an attitude towards communion that would be, eager for me to get my share while ignoring my neighbor next to me, right? And the person who is so jealous of their quiet and peace for their private time with Jesus that they turn around and loudly rebuke the single mother with the small kids who are sniffling and making noise, don't realize that in their quest to have their perfect relationship with the Eucharistic Lord, they've just stomped all over the mystical body of Christ that's present right beside them, right? And Pope Benedict talks about this in his encyclical Deus Caritas Est. He says that the Eucharist that does not eventuate in concrete works of charity, he says, is essentially fractured. I mean, that's the language he uses. This is a broken Eucharist if your sacramental piety does not lead to reverence to the mystical body of Christ, which is His church present in the persons of His members, then there's something broken in your Eucharistic piety. And it's possible to teach a devotion to the Eucharist that is false in that way, that does not eventuate in acts of charity. And that, again, that's a very deep problem. What are the solutions to this? Well, programmatically, there are things that can be done. There are systems within catechesis that are trying to address this. At your personal level, what you're doing is great. So reaching out and talking about the problem, being blunt about it, and finding like-minded people. I was talking to somebody the other day who had similar problems and said, Anders, I think you and I are the only people that are experiencing this. I said, no, we're just the only people that are talking about it, right? So talk, I mean, I've got friends that are good Catholic friends with whom I have good fellowship, and a lot of what we discuss is like some of the dysfunctional things that have driven a wedge between us and our own parishes. And that mutual shared experience of suffering is actually a point of contact that you can start becoming the answer to the problem that you've identified.
Suzanne, thanks so much for your call. Peter in Escondido, please call us back tomorrow. Dr. David Anders, thanks so much, my friend.
Hey, thank you, Tom.
See you.
The Immaculate Heart of Mary signifies the great purity and love of the heart of the Blessed Virgin Mary for God. It points us to her profound interior life, where she experienced both joys and sorrows, yet remained faithful, as we too are called to do. August is dedicated as the month of devotion to the Immaculate Heart of